Hello, I'm William Bryson, Chief of the City of Miami Department of Fire Rescue. Welcome to The First Paramedics, a documentary tribute to the doctors and paramedics who helped pioneer our emergency medical system. Miami was the first fire department in the United States to implement many paramedic innovations that are now commonplace worldwide. It was the first to use radio communication between doctors and paramedics, the first to create a team of paramedics, and in July of 1969, it was the first fire department in the United States to successfully defibrillate a clinically dead patient. This all started in the 1960s when Dr. Eugene Nagel, a young medical doctor and teaching physician, visited a Miami fire station. That chance meeting would evolve into a lifelong relationship with the fire service and many firsts for our national EMS system. Dr. Nagel began teaching firefighters advanced medical skills that were previously practiced only by doctors. He was soon joined by Dr. Jim Hirschman, a radio pioneer and cardiologist. Dr. Hirschman enabled the paramedics to transmit heart rates from EKGs in the field to doctors in the hospital through a process known as telemetry, making them perhaps the first true paramedics in the world. Today, Dr. Nagel still practices medicine in Winter Haven, Florida, where he remains a consultant for their EMS system. Dr. Jim Hirschman is the medical director for the city of Coral Gables, Florida, a neighboring municipality of Miami. This is their story, the story of two pioneer doctors and the first paramedics they trained.
A very good sign about hips is her legs are of equal length. Yeah. And she's got a pulse on that side. Pulses on both sides.
You needed to talk to her? Doctor? Okay, hold on the board for me. Right, I got you. Doesn't put down.
I was unaware of what Dr. Nagel was doing in teaching advanced first aid to the firefighters. He one day contacted me by telephone. I was a local practicing cardiologist. But one of my hobbies is amateur radio. And in pursuing my hobby as a cardiologist, I felt that I wanted to establish a communication link between my house and the hospital ship Hope. And at that time, 1966 or 67, the ship Hope was in Conakry in West Africa. I arranged for equipment to be sent to the ship to transmit electrocardiograms, EKGs, from the ship Hope back to my house in Coral Gables, Florida. So we did telemetry of EKGs over about a 5,000-mile path. And Dr. Nagel heard about this because I was a cardiologist and because I had achieved telemetry of physiologic data over a 5,000-mile path. He felt that I could be helpful to his enterprise.
Well, in the early days, we only had one rescue. And the ambulance service at the time was run out of funeral homes. And they used to race each other to get there, and who got there first got the victim.
If the patient died, they took them to the funeral parlor. And I think they got paid more money if they took them to the funeral parlor.
And they were very limited as to the medical help that they could give. They were splint, bandage, and wait for an ambulance to come get whoever they took care of.
The manner of rescue breathing was various types of arm lift, chest compression. And none of these methods, with the exception of one, would produce enough ventilation to be effective. CPR didn't exist.
Doctors were expected to walk around with knives in their pockets. And if a patient suffered a cardiac arrest, the doctor was expected to cut open the chest, put his hand through the hole he cut, and massage the heart.
In terms of the first contact with the fire department, that occurred when we had a cardiac arrest in the building I was living in. And the City of Miami fire rescue personnel came on the scene, and I first met a Lieutenant McCullough. And we had an unsuccessful CPR. And I asked Ken McCullough about how they were trained in CPR, and Ken said, but what's the use? They all die anyway.
But I tell them, I says, we resuscitate these people. I said, I've been doing this for 3 years, and I've resuscitated dozens and dozens of people. And we bring them into the hospital, and they all die. The people see us resuscitating them in the street, but we wheel them into the hospital, and the first thing they do is, oh, here comes another one. They're dead. It's all over. They didn't even work on them after we got them in there.
I guess you would say it's a little depressing that you get on the scene, you do your CPR and all that kind of stuff time and time again, and you always deliver a dead person to the hospital.
But that changed with EMS, paramedics, and the system that Dr. Nabel helped bring to the city of Miami.
So I went down to Station 1 in a few days and talked to them. And frankly, the firemen had had other doctors come down to the station at one time or another, and really they were just there to look at the equipment, and it was a one-time deal. But after a few weeks of coming down and talking to him, he saw I wasn't going to go away. And so we kind of, I think the fire department, rescue personnel, and I bonded. Well, when we actually started training, it was in 1968, and we did it in the dog lab at the medical school and in the morgue and in the classroom. We knew we didn't have the cooperation of the doctors by and large. They thought we were infringing on their medical turf. We knew that we didn't have the cooperation or the enthusiasm of the nurses. They felt that we were doing things that as yet they couldn't do. We knew that the public in general was not complaining about emergency care. And that all started to change when we got on the street.
We knew we were starting almost from ground zero with some of them, teaching the difference between an artery and a vein.
And fortunately, he was connected with the University of Miami School of Medicine, and we'd get some excellent training over there.
Often we would go to the medical examiner's office, Dr. Joe Davis. So Dr. Joe Davis, Dr. Jim Hirschman, and Dr. Nagel conducted classes in recognizing normal heart rhythms, ventricular fibrillation, and dangerous heart rhythms. Ventricular fibrillation is where the heart doesn't beat normal and just quivers, and it doesn't allow the blood to circulate.
If you're in ventricular fibrillation, you got to be counter shocked to get it out of there. And then we learned that by going over as teams to the dog labs and taking them poor dogs and putting them in ventricular fib, and then giving them CPR, then using cardiotonic drugs and defibrillating them before we did it on humans.
I think the worst time that I had on the rescue, that of all my experiences of 24 years on the rescue, is with the night we went over to Jackson Medical School over there and went up to the dog lab, and we put dogs down and brought them back with the defibrillator. That's when we were learning to defibrillate. And that was the worst night I've ever spent, and I went back to the station and I told Captain Pater, and I said, I'm not going to do that again.
Dr. Nagel started developing the telemetry unit, which was a great thing, so we could send the readings to the hospital and they could tell us what to do.
EKG telemetry is the taking of the electrical activity of the heart and converting it to a radio frequency signal.
So we went into the street with the ability to transmit an EKG over the radio telephone to the hospital, and when you would key the microphone, you'd tell the alarm office, give us 6238, and they would dial the number and you could hear it ring. Anybody standing in the crowd could hear it ring, and somebody would pick up the phone at the other end, and you would tell them who you were and what you were doing, what you saw, and they would tell you what they wanted you to do.
We had been training with the telemetry equipment for a number of months before we actually went online. And the defibrillators, they didn't have a great deal of concern about. But when I wanted to start IVs in the field with the paramedics, then the chief said, I remember he punched me in the chest with his finger He was about a 6'2" Irishman. And he said, "This is not a medical school, it's a fire department." And I said, "Yes, sir." And I said, "How about if we go in front of the City of Miami Commission?" There were 5 commissioners. And he said, "That would be all right."
In general, the government officials generally were reluctant to have their city involved or compromised by what seemed to be daring things at that time.
I'll never forget a meeting that we had with the Miami city manager, the fire chief, Larry Kinney, Dr. Nagel, and myself, and we went to see him about permission to start IVs in the street. And I'm going to tell you, the man was very difficult to deal with. He was abusive to us, to be very honest with you. He was not interested at all. Dr. Hirschman, in his very persuasive way, got him to pay attention and listen to what we had to say. I started an IV on Dr. Nagel right there in the room, and when we left, we had permission to do this, to go before the commission and get the final approval.
So on that day, we met the City of Miami Commission, including the mayor. One of them was the mayor. And they had a fine big setup at Dinner Key and a big table. They sat up higher than the ordinary people. And I made my little dog and pony presentation, and I said if I had a heart attack on the streets of Miami, I'd rather have the paramedics taking care of me than just some doctor who happened to be coming by, because they're trained to do it. And with that, I said, let me simulate a heart attack. And I took my jacket off and got up on their big fine table and laid down, and I said, I'm laying in the street and I'm having chest pain, and the City of Miami Fire Department is called, and these paramedics are going to take care of me. And so the paramedics came forward, and then they got an order over the radio, simulated order, to start an IV. And they shook out a 18-gauge needle, put it on the IV, stuck it in my arm, got a little blood on the table, had the IV dripping, and the commissioners all looked at one another and said, we don't see anything wrong with it. And that's how we went. We had to go a step at a time.
Intubation was a very difficult and one of the later things that we accomplished. It made it much more easy to resuscitate a person successfully if you had the ability to put this tube down into their airway and shut off the tube so that you didn't get vomit down the tube and into their lungs.
And so once again, I made the trek down to Dinner Key to see Chief Kenny. And he absolutely blew his top at intubation. Absolutely not. So I went away from Dinner Key, and I got the 6 original officers, and I said, we're going to go to the morgue and we're going to learn to intubate. And I said, we may never use it, but we're going to learn.
When we were learning to do intubation, we had a classroom session with Dr. Nagel and Dr. Harry Heinisch, who worked with Dr. Nagel at the time. And at the end of this class, Dr. Nagel and Dr. Heinisch anesthetized their own throats for us to look down their throats and stick a tube in them.
And then each of the 6 paramedics plus Harry intubated me. And I'm a gagger. I can't hardly stand a tongue blade. So they really had to spray me pretty good.
So Dr. Nagel and Dr. Heinisch went to the city manager's office and insisted that he watch. Dr. Nagel laid down on the city manager's table, and Dr. Heinisch then sprayed a little Novocaine down Dr. Nagel's throat and put in an endotracheal tube. After that, the city manager agreed we could continue what we were doing.
I'm going to tell you that is dedication, because nobody's sticking a tube down my throat while I'm awake.
And then the next morning, I went down to see Chief Kenny. And I told him what we had done. And his eyes rolled back in his head, and he said, all right, they can intubate or try to intubate once. And if they don't make it on the first try, then it's bag and mask into the hospital. I said, fair enough, Chief. And that's how intubation got started.
Once Dr. Nagel, specifically Dr. Nagel, was brash enough to demonstrate some of these things and how the firefighters could learn to do them and do them well, then the bureaucrats and the mayors and so on acquiesced and began to cheer for what we were doing.
A lot of the medical community down there couldn't believe that firemen were giving IVs, they were doing defibrillation, they were putting endotracheal tubes in people, and it was quite a revelation for them.
The medical community was at least partially adverse to what we were doing, thinking that we were giving the practice of medicine over to non-medical people.
I think the best thing that ever happened is when the residents, the interns over there, and the nurses would have to come out and start riding on the trucks with us. The first few people that came out from the hospital with us, we saw that they couldn't believe what we were doing.
Well, we were at the point where our men were trained, and so we said, watch for a case of a man who's recently fallen in ventricular fibrillation, and then go ahead and resuscitate him. And they found a man and found him in ventricular fibrillation, defibrillated him, and he became a long-term survivor. That was the first pre-hospital successful resuscitation in the USA.
You know, when you see somebody arrive at the hospital who's technically dead and arrive there alive, that kind of gives you a little boost.
Not too long after that, we were issued some new equipment. It was to apply pressure to an IV bag so you could pump IVs in at a rapid rate through a large bore needle. We learned this in the afternoon. They gave us the equipment, we put it on the truck, and that night about 2 o'clock in the morning, we had a stabbing up the street from the fire station. We arrived at the scene and the police officer was flagging us down and saying, "Sorry I called you. The man is dead. We just wanted some chalk to chalk out the line in the street." We jumped out of the truck and said, "This is a good chance to use our large bore IV and our new ability to pump these IVs in." We started 2 IVs on him, 1 in each arm, applied pressure to the bags, filled him with 2 liters of fluid, and the man woke up right there. Before we got him to the hospital, he was talking.
So I know the firefighters loved what they were doing. Each one of them told us later that they felt they finally could help people rather than just hold them in their arms while they died.
During that year of training, I think Jim Hirschman, my partner, and I enjoyed their enthusiasm, their dedication, the fact that they would put in hours after they worked and wouldn't get paid for it. And in a way, I enjoyed training them as much or maybe more than medical students.
Both Dr. Nagel and I enjoyed teaching, and the firefighters were some of the most eager and capable students I've ever encountered in my whole career.
Dr. Nagel and Dr. Hirschman were loved by all the firefighters. We thought we worked hard. We'd go on the 12 or 15 or 20 calls a day and would be up at night, but we got to go home the next day. Dr. Nagel and Dr. Hirschman listened to that radio 24 hours a day, every day. And they responded at 3 o'clock in the morning, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Christmas Day, New Year's Day. They were always there.
The interface between fire rescue, those men we had trained and their equipment, and the hospital itself was actually only with Dr. Nagel and with me. We both carried belt radios, and we communicated with the fire rescue people out in the field. Other people did not communicate with the fire rescue people.
And we only had 1 rescue truck in the whole city of Miami. So we were making long runs and everything.
So you actually taught firefighters first to begin with?
That's all we had.
That's all you had?
Yeah.
No EMS?
No.
It's amazing, like me coming
Well, they
up-
were rescued.
Right.
I once asked my 3 kids when they were together, what was the worst thing about growing up in our home with your mother and your dad? And it kind of shocked the 3 of them. But my youngest daughter, never at a loss for words, and with a firecracker temper, I saw her eyes narrow down, I could almost see smoke come out of the nostrils. And she said, well, I can tell you, she said, we never had a meal but what that damn radio went off. So I guess that it did affect the family.
Now give us our print test. User test passed, and we're good to go.
Okay, great. Nowadays they digitize the signal and send digital information and then de-digitize it
when it
and make
gets
it
to
into
the
an
source.
analog signal.
Interesting, huh?
We were involved in people coming into the fire station from all over the world to view our program. They were there from Japan, from Israel, from California, the United Press, all of the newspapers, the television stations. They were in the section. It was an exciting new thing that was happening in the fire service. I remember giving a talk to a group of nurses, and my title of my talk was "They All Still Die." And at that time, Miami's system was very new around the country. And we'd talk about the things that we could do in Miami. But what happens in your city? Do they still get a ride in a hearse? Do they get a paramedic, or do they all still die? And some of our early successes were people that were in town on vacation and were resuscitated in Miami. Had they dropped dead where they lived, they wouldn't have been alive, but they dropped dead in Miami. And they were resuscitated successfully and went home. Do they all still die where you live?